Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Genetics. Genetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here with Matt Burgess today, who is the host of another podcast that you should definitely check out called the Demystifying Genetics podcast. I came across Matt actually listening to his podcast, and I thought it was super interesting. And you all know, if you've listened to this podcast for a long time, that I love a crossover episode with a fellow genetics podcaster because we can get into some of the work that you do and what you talk about on the podcast, but also it's an interesting opportunity to just learn about how you think about what direction the space is going and some of the most interesting guests you've had in the past. So thank you for joining me and looking forward to the deep dive today.
G'day. Thank you. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, and we get a good day because you're calling in from Australia. So we're at 9 a.m. UK. And what time is it for you there? 6 or 7 or something?
Yeah, it's 8 p.m. And I must admit, I am much more of a morning person. I was falling asleep on the couch as I was watching The Traders, but I've just had a little coffee and I've perked up. So I think I'll be okay.
Well, we really appreciate you stepping outside of the 8 o'clock is late, but we're going to try to keep the energy high here. Before we get into your background, I actually want to start with a really interesting story that I have in your note. Centers around Olivia Newton John and the cancer center that you spent some time at. Could you just tell that story? I think it gives a sense of your personality and also some of the experiences that have shaped you.
Sure. I was working as a genetic counselor at a large public hospital in Melbourne called the Austin, and the Austin were building a cancer center. And I'm not sure of the history, but somehow Olivia Newton John signed up to become involved, and she had had breast cancer before, but she's Australian, she's from Melbourne, but she was living in America. But they created the Olivia Newton John Cancer and Wellness Center at Austin Hospital. So every year she would come to the hospital and there would just be events where we could go and sort of hang out and meet her. And my colleague Ellie and I, over the years, whenever Olivia was coming, we'd get so nervous and excited. It's like, oh, let's go and see Livy. And so probably sort of in the 8 years I was working there, I probably saw her. Yeah, probably once a year, like so maybe
Wow.
eight or 9 times. And just there were funny little sort of anecdotes, or like one time she said, "Oh, Matt, what do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a genetic counselor." And she said, "Oh, would it be interesting to do some genetic testing on people, but if they test positive, we'll just tell them that they're negative and we'll see what happens." And I was like, "Oh, Livy, that is interesting. Yes, I agree that
Interesting, yes.
would be interesting. I'm not sure it's very ethical,
Yeah.
but
Interesting
yeah."
that you think that's something we could do. Yeah.
And then there's another time, I'm not a singer, but she sort of sat down, and I think as a famous person, like a celebrity, you just have to make conversation up. And she sort of got us all to sing the national anthem with her. And it was just hilarious that I'm sitting at this table, I can't sing, and then we're singing the national anthem. But I've got really good memories, and poor Livy passed away now. But yeah, it was fun.
That's not an experience that most genetic counselors get. So that's super cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'd love to start with your career. You are a genetic counselor. You've also spent time as a medical science liaison and other kinds of roles in and out of the healthcare and pharma space. If you could just help people who don't know much about genetic counseling or these sorts of roles, if you could just give a quick overview of your career and how you got into this, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So when I was at high school, I remember in year nine or grade nine, I did genetics and learned Punnett squares and sort of dominant and recessive inheritance, and I absolutely loved it. So, like, I think genetics grabbed me quite early on. And then in grade 10, I had a lovely science teacher. We actually share the same last name, but we're not related, Miss Burgess. And she was my science teacher for about a month. And then she left teaching to become, like, to study genetic counseling. So she actually enrolled in the first genetic counseling program in Australia back in 95. So I found out about genetic counseling when I was in high school, which is really sort of a little bit rare. And I finished school and then I was an exchange student and I enrolled in an arts degree and then changed to science and changed majors and picked up a diploma and changed universities. And sort of at the end, my dad was like, Matt, I don't care what you finish, just finish something, just get the
Yeah.
piece of paper, just finish. But I finished a science degree and then I enrolled in genetic counseling. And back then, about 20 years ago, it was a 1 year course. So, genetic counselors are postgraduately trained healthcare professionals, and we usually work in large hospitals or different healthcare settings and talk to people about genetics and explain the results and organize tests and talk about risk and that sort of thing. Yeah, so I started off as a genetic counselor out in the community setting and sort of worked rurally for a little while and then moved on to Sydney and then moved to Melbourne and where I worked at some of the largest public hospitals in Australia. Yeah, and sort of different areas of clinical genetics. And yeah, that's kind of how it all started.
Whenever people hear about genetic counseling, one of the first things they hear as a follow-up is about the massive shortage of genetic counselors and the impact that has on people getting access to pre-genetic test counseling, post-test counseling. Sometimes you hear of wait times that are 6 months, 9 months, a year to get counseling for some of these important things. I wonder if you could talk about what drives that shortage a little bit and any solutions that you see. There's a lot of discussion about scaling the workforce and making sure that people have access to this careers. There's also a technology element of this too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel old with that sort of question, and maybe we all sort of feel old. And I know I sort of have a little bit of Peter Pan syndrome, but I can't believe I've been a genetic counselor for about 20 years now. But in that time, I've really seen how things have changed and evolved. Like
Yeah.
at the start, we used to sit down and talk to people for an hour about having a test for one gene and the pros and cons of that test and whether to go ahead and what it means. And that's sort of good basic genetic counseling. But as time has gone on, we have panels now where we can look at many genes at once or look at a person's whole
Yeah.
exome or genome. And testing has become quicker and less expensive. So I really feel like when I started out, genetics departments where clinical geneticists and genetic counselors worked were the gatekeepers of genetic testing.
Right.
And really in clinical medicine, like if you're diagnosed with cancer, for example, genetics was the last thing on, like, they're kind of like, once you finish all of your treatment, yes,
Right.
it's an appropriate referral to genetics, but we'll think about that down the track. Whereas now, for the cancer example, like genetics is the first thing that the doctors want. It's kind of like, we want you to do your genetic test, and then that will help guide where we go.
Yeah.
And the other thing that sort of changed is we, as I said, we used to be the gatekeepers, but now basically every specialist sort of orders genetic testing themselves. So I guess how we provide genetic counseling is different, and maybe we don't do as much pre-test counseling and sort of focus on the post-test.
Yeah. Do you think that's the right direction? Well, I had a really interesting interview a while ago with Wendy Chung, who's running a big newborn screening program. And she said something really thought provoking, which is that I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but she felt like over time, genetics was going to become more and more in the water, so to speak, from a sociocultural perspective. People will understand a little bit more about what it is and isn't. That might reduce the need for pre-test counseling, and especially in something like newborn screening, where the pre-test counseling in a healthy parent could. What do you discuss? 95% of the time it'll be fine, but 5% of the time it could be one of thousands of things, and I want to prepare you for that. And so I think the position she was taking is that over time, it might be more like pre-test counseling is about robust education and understanding about what the outcomes could be. And more the resource shifts to post-test counseling, where once you've had the result and you really talk about what's the impact on me, impact on my family. I wonder what you think about that and how that might be different across different disease areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that Wendy says is quite profound.
Yes, that is true.
She's amazing. Yeah, like such an interesting question. And I think it sort of comes down to like the history and philosophy of genetics. And in many other areas of medicine, I feel like the doctors and nurses are quite sort of, they tell you what to do. Or it's like, oh, doctor, I don't know what to do. Like if you go and see your GP, she might take your blood pressure and you don't really understand why. And she orders like a couple of tests and you don't really understand what they are. And then you do them. And then if they come
Right.
back normal, that's the whole conversation. And it's not until something comes back abnormal that she'll actually say, oh, actually, this is what I tested you
Right.
for. And I think in genetics, and it's sort of like a reaction to sort of the eugenics movement from Hitler and World War II. Genetics has sort of evolved to be sort of the absolute opposite of that. We don't want to be directive. We do not want to tell you what to do. Our job is to give you the information so we can enable or empower you to make the best decisions possible. And I think that is, it's an honorable sort of aim, but when it comes to practice, how realistic is that? I don't think it's any medical person's job to say you should terminate or you should do this or that. But sometimes not giving any sort of help or guidance isn't that practical either. And so I think our aim in genetics as genetic counselors was to speak to every single person who's having a genetic test and making sure that they're well informed before they have the test. Whereas in 2025, we just know that that's not realistic.
Right.
Most people that are having tests are not having this deep informed consent process. They're having a genetic test. They may know to some level what's going on, but really where we add value is sort of at the end where we're sort of explaining what it means to that person and what it means to their family.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was interested in actually deep diving into an area where you spent, I think, 3 or 4 years of your life, which is a rare disease called AP4, hereditary spastic paraplegia. You did a basically a clinical doctorate where you went deep into this particular therapy area, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that work because it's a condition where there's gene therapies available. This is almost like the tip of the spear, the most challenging part of genetics right now from a decision making perspective, from parents, from how do you actually counsel in these cases where many of the outcomes are unknown, right? By definition, these are early stage clinical trials. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that work and what you learned through it.
Sure. I remember I enrolled in a Doctor of Health Science, and I think, like a lot of people probably listening to the podcast, I was a little bit nerdy and really excited about studying and kind of thinking of different sort of areas to do my research. And I knew that I wanted a really interesting genetic counseling project. And one of my friends is a clinical geneticist, Maya Chopra, and she is Aussie. I met her when we were both working in Sydney.
I listened to her episode on your podcast, by the way, and highly recommend that to anyone else. It was super interesting.
Yeah, she's amazing. Thanks. Yeah, she works in Boston at Harvard now, and I was lucky enough to sort of bring her on as my supervisor. And I was like, oh, Maya, I really want a really interesting project. I want to do something that I'm really fascinated about and get really excited. And do you have any ideas? And she sort of rattled off about 3 or 4, and I kept thinking, God, these all sound pretty boring. Like, I'm not really that interested. And then she said, what about doing a qualitative study where you can speak to the parents of children with this really rare neurogenetic condition about gene therapy? And
Yeah.
I just thought, oh my God, that sounds amazing. Like, I got really excited. It's like, it's genetic counseling, it's qualitative research, it's gene therapy, which I think is like one of the next big things in genetics, and sort of like brings in this ethical component. And it's a very interesting condition because there's only about 500 people in the world that have a reported or a documented case of this condition. So it's extremely rare. There's probably many more people that just are yet to be diagnosed. They sort of have symptoms of cerebral palsy. So I think if we tested a lot of people with CP, they would probably, well, not a lot, but some of those would get a diagnosis. But it sort of was coming down to the ethics of how do we decide on which conditions we should provide gene therapy for? And because there's only 500 people in the world with this condition, is it ethical yet to create gene therapy for this condition?
Why
And
would it be unethical?
well, I guess from a utilitarian point of view, like maybe like the best thing we could do is to provide gene therapy for conditions that affect lots of people. Because
Right. Okay.
like if it's we've only got a finite amount of resources, then let's try and help the most people that we can with what we have. And I guess another thing in sort of clinical medicine that I've seen is sometimes it depends on who is affected with these conditions to what sort of attention that they get. Like I know when Kylie Minogue was diagnosed with breast cancer, then there was a lot of attention on breast cancer.
Yeah.
And so for AP4 HSP, there just happened to be some really well connected sciencey parents that sort of banded together and said, we want to make this happen, and they made it happen. And so I think that's interesting.
Did you come to a conclusion at the end? It's a big question. I understand where you're coming from, that especially if you're thinking about, let's say, grant funding or something. If you're the National Science Foundation, you have to think in that utilitarian perspective, right? Versus if I'm a parent of a kid with AP4 HSP, like, I'm going for it, right? And I'm going to do everything I can to put that top of the list.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's gene therapy for conditions like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where people have normal intelligence but physical abnormalities. There's also some literature about gene therapy for conditions like Down syndrome, where there's a cognitive component. And what was really interesting was they've sort of, when I was doing my research, then I just finished a phase 1 and 2 clinical trial with 2 people that were affected with this condition. And people with AP4 HSP have physical abnormalities or physical sort of ailments, but they also have intellectual disability. So it's sort of a combination of both. And the scientists sort of just assumed that the parents would want the IQ of their children raised. They thought that not only would they want the physical problems fixed, but they would want the cognitive problems addressed as well. And basically, all of the parents said, if we could give this medicine to our children and it just stopped the progression of the disease and didn't touch or like affect the cognitive ability, we'd be extremely happy with that.
Right.
And I found that fascinating because I think that when we think of gene therapy, we think about a cure, and then it's sort of just brought up, like my research just brought up this whole thing, like, what is a cure? Like with cancer, you kind of have like a really good understanding of what a cure means, but then in a condition like this, it's like, oh, well, what is a cure?
Yes. Yeah, I've heard this in lots of different fields, and I think it's really interesting too. Some other examples are, for example, the deaf community. There's a lot of different opinions on whether gene therapies or other approaches to treat deafness are it's a broad and heterogeneous group of people, right? Some people say, yes, absolutely, that's what I want for me or for my kids. Other people say, actually, I want society to accept us and not insist on a cure for this. I've heard the same with short stature, achondroplasia, hypochondroplasia. There's a lot of different opinions in the community of should we. Some of the treatments are perhaps because it's easiest to measure in a clinical trial are focused on growth, but there are like the pain associated with the condition or other things that may be downstream of growth but may be separate. It's a nuanced conversation, right? What are we treating here? Are we treating height and growth? Or are we treating the symptoms? And I think the real treatments or cures in quotes need to focus on what the community actually wants, right? Versus something that's easy to measure.
Yeah, yeah. And just not making an assumption about what parents want. Yeah. It kind of seems straightforward, but it was really interesting research to undertake.
Yeah, I mean, doing a lot of work at the interface of like translational and clinical trials over the past years has taught me how hard it is to do these things in practice because you have the tension between running the clinical trial or experiment that is like practical and feasible to do in a certain amount of time, right? What can we actually measure? What is the closest approximate that we have to helping the community versus the measuring the exact thing that the community wants, and also how you deal with the differences of opinion. Some people will say, like, absolutely, I'm happy with this approach, whereas other people will say, no, it needs to be different and better. So it is such a complex web of puzzle pieces to put together, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And even sometimes between the parents, like the mum and
Yeah.
the dad of an affected child, want different things. So even within the same family, they can be like massively different opinions as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have obviously anonymized and generalized, but with the work you've done in the past, how do you handle those kind of really challenging family situations where, and I suspect sometimes in the conversations you're having, it's not one-to-one. Sometimes it is multiple family members because they want to have the discussion together. Maybe you could talk a little about how you handle that on like a practical, personal level, because those conversations are very tricky.
Well, I guess that sort of brings up the question of like the difference between a researcher and then clinical genetic counseling. So I think I'll answer as a genetic counselor,
Yeah.
when couples have differing opinions, it's a really interesting conversation. And I think that my job is really just to get people talking and to really sort of voice what they're thinking. It's like sort of facilitating a conversation. I kind of feel like some of the doctors kind of give the information and then say, there you go. Well, you just tell me what you want or you go away and think about
Yeah.
it. Whereas with genetic counseling, normally we have time to sort of sit down in an appointment and to go through things. And I actually like when people say, Matt, I don't know. Like, I don't know what I want to do. Like,
Right.
my wife wants to do this and I'm unsure. And it's just sort of like maybe it's going through the pros and cons, or thinking, is this a decision that we need to make today? Or can we
Yeah.
make it in a week? Or can we make it in a month? Or if we make one decision now, can we change our mind? And
Right.
yeah, so I just find providing that safe space without judgment, and it's really a place where people can sort of chat about things. That's what I enjoy.
Yeah, I think you mentioned before the word, like actually the word counseling in particular can be a little bit of a challenge, right? If you were to rebrand, because some people they just have a gut reaction to counseling because their parents said like they were negative on going to counseling or those sorts of things or whatever reason, which is like really not connected to what it actually is. If you could rebrand the term or the field or just talk about it differently, what do you think would be a better, more
Oh
accessible way of describing it?
God, you have just like identified like one of the main issues in genetic counseling. Like, I think the term was sort of first coined, I don't know, in the 50s or 60s.
Right.
And there's been sort of discussion about changing our name or rebranding, but I think sort of the horse has really bolted.
Right.
Like, in some parts of the world, genetic counselors refer to themselves as genetic associates. And it's hard because we do have good training in counseling and communication, but I think you're right that that word counselor really does put people off. I remember I saw a couple and they were both teachers, and I think maybe like one was a school counselor and one was like maybe a psych teacher or something like that. And they kind of said, Matt, we don't want the the counseling. We just want the information. Like, so
Right.
don't give us the counseling. Yeah, we just kind of want to go ahead with testing. And I said, yep, that's fine. Well, I won't do any of the counseling stuff, but maybe we can just talk a little bit about the condition.
Right.
Maybe we'll go through the consent form. I'll probably talk to you about the inheritance and what it means if you test positive and what it means to you. And I'll take the sample and we'll talk about the results. How does that sound? And they said, oh, that sounds perfect. And it's like, well, that's exactly what genetic counseling is. I didn't actually change my session whatsoever, but they just felt much better that they weren't getting the counseling version of my session.
Yeah, it's funny what the meaning we attach to words, and I've seen research in the past as well that because women are generally more comfortable going to counseling in all forms. We men have trouble accepting that counseling in the broader societal sense is a helpful thing for all kinds of reasons. But I think you get a difference in people taking up this sort of thing simply because they look at the word and go like, counseling, I don't need counseling, right? Like it's amazing what a word choice can do to all these downstream impacts.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know if like genetic advisor or genetics educator or
navigator, maybe. Yeah, there's a lot, I mean, but these rebrands are hard. Like we do some work in a condition called MASH, metabolic associated steatohepatitis. A couple of years ago, it was called NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and people were grumbling for years about, we basically define this condition as what it's not. It's non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and like they basically completely changed the nomenclature of the field. It took a couple of years to got everybody behind it, but it was really interesting to watch actually at the big conferences they were rolling out. Like this is basically the map from what it used to be to what it now is. And yeah, I've just never really seen that before. And I just thought it was interesting to watch like how a whole field can get behind a name change like that.
Yeah. I mean, it happened with, I'm putting myself on the spot now with FMR1, like the gene for Fragile X.
Yeah.
Like it used to be mental retardation, but then they have renamed it. And I can't remember what it is, but I think that was like a real positive move to move it away from a word that has such strong negative connotations.
I was curious to ask about some of your favorite podcasts that you've had on Demystifying Genetics. I haven't listened to all of them, but I've listened to quite a few. I'll share some of my favorites. So I'm curious what your favorites have been over the years.
Well, I think
it's a hard question. You're not really supposed to put somebody on the spot about their favorite. Some memorable ones, not a favorite.
Okay. Well, I mean, I need to say, like, my podcast is called Demystifying Genetics, and then I say with whoever my host is, my guest. And on the first episode, I was actually the guest, and my husband was the host. And he had his friend from his best mate from America was in town in Melbourne, and we hired the podcast venue to do the recording on a Sunday morning, and he went out with his friend on the Saturday night, and I went out as well, but I went home sort of quite early, and he got home very late, very drunk, and the next morning he was like, oh, I'm too sick, I can't do this, like I'll pay to like change it to another day. And I was like, no, you will get up and you will host this podcast,
drink some coffee and get in there.
Yes, I don't care how sick you're feeling. And then you listen to that podcast, I think he did a stellar job. Like he sounds amazing. And as soon as the red light in the studio came on, he sort of sounded like a professional. So that was sort of a funny one. I did a podcast with John Conahan, who is a Huntington disease social worker. And I feel like that was the one where we went sort of the deepest. I feel like we really sort of had like a very sort of deep conversation about Huntington disease and predictive testing and the psychosocial issues involved with HD. And I think that was a really cool episode as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is a fascinating like area for genetic counselors. I think it's some of the biggest challenges you can possibly imagine, right? So you can break that journey down in a million different ways.
Yeah. I mean, I love neurogenetics, and it's such a horrible condition, but it was one of my it's one of my favorite conditions to work with in the clinic. So to sort of speak to somebody who's been working with these families for about 40 years was really, really cool.
Yeah. The one that like maybe this is just outing me as like being interested in drama, but the one that I really liked was with Susan Manley from Myriad Genetics. I think I might have mentioned this to you before, but what Myriad has been criticized in the past for a number, like the most notable one being their approach to attempting to patent genes. This was going back years ago, but what I really liked is I felt like, to Susan's credit, who joined the podcast, she was really open and willing to engage and discuss on these big issues that I think in most cases people would just decline to have that conversation. And I thought it was like, I don't know, I just thought it was really interesting to hear you asking like the tough questions, but also hear her engaging with it. It was like, it was something you only get on podcasting. You could never get, like, that would never make it into a blog post or something like that. It just wouldn't happen.
Yeah. I'm not a journalist. I haven't studied journalism or podcasting. I kind of feel like I just make it up. Like
Yeah.
I don't know what the rules are, but normally my style is not to be too confrontational, and we can have a really good conversation about something without getting too controversial. And
Yeah.
if some of my guests don't feel comfortable to actually disclose where they work, and that's fine. Like, we don't have to mention a place of work. But I was living in America and I worked as a medical science liaison, and I was lucky enough to get a 6-month contract at Myriad. And Myriad just had, or has, I mean, I think it's changing, but a little bit of a bad reputation because of patenting the BRCA genes and not submitting data to ClinVar, and just being a little bit sort of not open with things. And I think it was like on my first or second day, I I can't. I think maybe Susan sent a big email out, and I thought, oh, she's one of the senior genetic counselors, and I just loved the tone of the email. It was really
Yeah.
lovely, and I think I just replied to her and said, "Oh, hi, Susan. My name's Matt. I'm a genetic counselor. It's like my first week. I really liked your email, and I just wanted to say hello." And she emailed back and said, "Great to have you on the team, Matt. Let's meet for a coffee." And she just was one of the most positive people that I worked
Yeah.
with at Myriad. Like, I actually found it to be sort of a hard job, and there was lots of politics involved. And then she agreed to be on my podcast, and she said that she was happy to answer those hard questions. And I feel like the questions that most genetic counselors and maybe some other people in sort of clinical genetics have. And yeah, she was able to go there. And I thought that it was a really good episode because we did have such an honest conversation.
Yeah, for me, it was also interesting this summer that Supreme Court decision was decided. I think it was in 2013 that basically meant they couldn't patent the BRCA genes. I was an intern at Invitae, which was basically a competitor genetic testing company, and people may be familiar with it, but they literally had a party in the office celebrating the Supreme, because it was pretty existential to their business and to many others on if genes are patentable, this absolutely changes the landscape. And I just remember that moment, and like that's the first I heard of the company. I don't even remember, I was 20 years old probably. So it was just kind of an interesting moment in time for me where like this is really interesting how these Supreme Court decisions actually can have a profound impact on downstream how this whole thing evolves for people and what it means basically.
Yeah, like I'm trying to remember what it was like in Australia at the time, because I was definitely working in genetics, and I was even worked like organizing cancer genetic testing. But I think we kind of thought, oh, like I think as Australians, I think we're quite laid back and
Yeah.
sort of a bit laissez-faire. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think that there was one company that had the official licensing rights to perform BRCA testing in Australia. So if you ordered the test from that company, then royalties went to Myriad. But I think there were a number of other labs in Australia that were doing the testing, and they were like, as if we're going to get sued, like, bring it
Right.
on. So
Yeah.
I think that we didn't really pay, we weren't taking it that seriously. But obviously, when the ruling came down, we were all very excited about it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I can't quite remember. Yeah, I wish I sort of had a better understanding of what was going on down here.
Yeah. Speaking of Australia and the US, you've spent a lot of time in both. What are the big differences that stand out to you between the way genetic counseling and maybe clinical genetics more broadly works in the two countries?
Oh, wow. So, America is an amazing country, but the healthcare system there is one of the most complex and convoluted in the world. So, I just feel like even though I loved living in America and there was lots of fun things about it, like just healthcare was really complicated. I remember thinking like, I am an intelligent guy. I'm postgraduately trained. English is my first language. I have no idea how this works.
Right.
Like, I don't understand it. Like how, like this is so
Yeah.
complicated. Like, like why can you only apply for health insurance during like 3 months of the year when it's like open or like it just I just didn't get it. And like I think in Australia, like it's not perfect down here. And yeah, there are massive issues with our healthcare system as well, but it's just a lot more straightforward. One of the things that really sort of was difficult to get my head around, it's like I kind of just remember thinking when I worked for different labs, how much does the test cost? Like I just want like
Right.
just tell me the price. How much does it cost?
Yeah.
I like if it's $100, I've got no problem with someone making a fair profit on that. But if it costs $100, why are the insurance companies paying $5,000 for that?
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. So yeah, I think sort of insurance and payment and reimbursement is much easier in Australia than in America.
Yeah, we work with lots of different genetic testing labs around the world, and it still blows my mind in the US how we can talk to two labs that are like streets away, and one of them will say it's $5,000 for an exome, and the other one will say it's 500 or 200, and you're like, what? How? Like, this is not. There's not an efficient market here. There's something
Yeah.
strange going on. Yeah,
So how long have you been in the UK now?
more than 10 years, coming up on 11, I think now.
So do you feel more British in your sort of sciencey health kind of way of life, or is that sort of strong
Yeah.
American sort of part of you still there?
As you can tell from my accent, I definitely still have a lot of American in me. I love the single payer system in the UK. I've got to say, it is the like on a macro level, they spend quite a bit less than the US for similar outcomes. On a personal level, like we've had some, I've shared before on the show, we had very complicated pregnancies and not having to think about will my insurance pay for this? Do I have to get it pre-authorized? Like you can just show up and they take care of you and it's really good. It's like it's hard to overstate what that feels like as a parent when you have a kid that's sick. And from a scientific perspective, I think that the UK is really great, and the health system in particular has been way ahead of the curve on genetics. So it's really great from that perspective. The US is still my home though. Like that's where when I think about home, I do think about there. But I wish that I know why the system is so crazy, and it goes like way back to wage freezes and in private healthcare being a way to increase people's wages without really a wage increase, but it's resulted in this Frankenstein system that I don't think anyone really understands. And it results in these crazy outcomes that so for the US, I wish some kind of change on the system because I don't think it's working for anybody, and it seems like it's headed for a long term set of major problems. I mean, it's already problematic how much we spend compared to other places. The only thing I guess the only in because the UK is like they have such a strong negotiating position because it's a single payer system and a big population. This does result in different sets of ethical challenges for rare disease families actually, because sometimes things will go on the market in the US straight away because people with insurance can get it. They negotiate with Medicare, whatever it is, but the UK will often end up in protracted negotiations or just say no to things if they don't think the cost benefit is right. And so again, from the perspective of a rare disease family, you have to wonder, like, my child hasn't gotten this because we're in protracted negotiations, but the UK is thinking about the system as a whole, so it presents a different set of challenges, I think.
Yeah, yeah, spot on.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, the to me, the single payer system is very well set up for genetics because you can think long term, right? And I think it's no surprise why the UK is investing so much in rare disease diagnostics and cancer treatments and newborn screening programs and those sorts of things, because you can start to think about, this is a test that uniquely, unlike blood pressure or cholesterol or anything else, we can do it once actually, and then analyze the data over time. I think that's super unique.
Yeah.
You're starting a company. You're opening a private practice, I think, Rosalind Genetics. We were talking a little bit before the show, but one of the things that you hear everywhere, and we talked about previously, is access to genetic counseling, and even in public health systems like you have in Australia and like we have here in the UK, it doesn't always mean that you can get these kind of things in a timely manner. And if you're like we talked about previously, if you're running a clinical trial or you're running something that's research based and outside of the healthcare system, often the pathways aren't super clear. So I'd love if you could share a little bit about what drove you to start Rosalind, of course named after Rosalind Franklin. I assume the woman who gets not nearly as much credit as she deserves for her role in discovery of the DNA helix.
Spot on, yes. Yeah, I don't know. Like, having been a genetic counselor for over 20 years now, it's kind of like, what next? And having had some really interesting sort of experiences working in the industry in America, I feel like I have been exposed to some really advantageous sort of business sort of side of things. But, also in sort of research and doing my doctorate and teaching genetic counseling, I feel like I've sort of, yeah, there's sort of different sort of components that are all coming together. I really like the idea of sort of working for myself and having my own sort of business. So yeah, I'm working on a private genetics company at the moment called Rosalind Genetics. So hopefully by the time this podcast goes to air, there'll be some more sort of details about that. But really, yeah, sort of just confined to Australia, genetic counselling and testing. But I don't know, like I don't know if it's like a little bit of a hobby or where it'll go, but I'm writing a sort of genetic counselling based novel.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
so sort of just working, plugging away on that a little bit at a time. But I'm also involved with genetic education and sort of like, I'm based in Australia, but I teach in a master's program in the United States. I just went to the World Congress of Genetic Counselling in London, or in England, in Cambridge, and sort of met genetic counsellors from all over the world. And that kind of got me thinking about genetic education, and especially in countries where, not all of us can access sort of university level like courses, and how we can sort of provide for that. So yeah, I feel like I've sort of got my fingers in a number of little different pies at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. I have you've popped another question in my head. I have maybe a final ethical conundrum to leave you with and get your thoughts on, which is around AI and large language models. And yeah, that something that I think about is, if you accept the fact that genetic education, genetic counseling on a personalized level is extremely limited, and you can develop a large language model or something that you could prove to be as effective as the median genetic counselor, but could be made available to people around the world at low or virtually no cost. How do you think about that? I assume this is probably something that comes up a lot at WCGC and other kinds of conferences.
Yeah, there was a genetic counselor from Scandinavia that was talking to us about this very issue, and she did a PhD about a chatbot. And it was interesting that I learned all about sort of AI and the differences between large learning models. And like, I love ChatGPT, but we know that it just makes things up, and it's not 100% reliable. And if people are using something like ChatGPT or like an AI where it's you're getting advice or information, but you don't know how to vet it or check to see the veracity or like, is it accurate? That can be really dangerous. If you're using something like a chatbot where all of the answers are sort of programmed and they're sort of programmed by people that really know what they're doing, maybe that can be helpful. We know that there aren't enough genetic counselors to go around. So maybe something needs to change, and maybe we can get sort of more bang for our buck with sort of that pre-test education. And then you meet with a real person to go through the results and really talk about what this means. And I think that's probably where things are going. And I don't really have too much of an issue with that.
Yeah. I'm thinking about whether, like, as the models get better and better, and if you can comprehensively solve the hallucination issue and have fact checking. There's some interesting, like, I've seen some I think I saw it on Reddit, a publication where they compared. There's basically a Reddit forum that has people can post their medical issues and doctors will come in and answer the questions. And what they did is they basically scrambled the real doctor responses to these from Reddit. They also got like true doctors that they could verify were doctors to answer it. And then they had a large language model answer it. And then the graders basically didn't know which was which, obviously. And they scored it on accuracy, on empathy, and these kind of things. It was really interesting, like in different circumstances. They also combined the doctor alone or the doctor using AI to help them write the first version and then answer it. And of all these I've seen, they seem to be getting better and better, where I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple of years you look at a response from a professional and you look at a response from an LLM, and most of the time it may be hard to distinguish, or the LLM may be better just because it has infinite time to think about the best, most empathetic, accurate response. And it kind of reminds me of the self-driving car problem of as a society, we may not accept that the self-driving car is just as good as us. We may actually create a much higher bar where once the self-driving cars are absolutely excellent, then they get on the road. But it probably isn't acceptable for it to be as good as the average genetic counselor, right? We need it to be really good for people to wrap their head around, like, well, if it makes a mistake, whose fault is it, right?
Yes, I think we still need a human there somewhere. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, Matt, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time. It was a great discussion. I encourage everybody to check out Demystifying Genetics, Matt's podcast. And is there anywhere else that people to look or keep track of you on Twitter, LinkedIn, website for Rosalind Genetics yet?
Yeah. So I guess just on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, rosalindgenetics.com. Hopefully we'll be live soon. Not so much Twitter, but yeah.
Mass exodus from Twitter lately, hasn't there been? Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, Google Demystifying Genetics, you'll find me.
Amazing. Well, Matt, thank you. And thanks everyone, as always, for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Cynogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit cynogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.